Taming the High Cost of College, bonus episode 18.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello, and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge, and today we have a bonus episode where we're going to talk with Justin Muchnick about boarding school. Justin wrote a book called Boarding School Survival Guide, where he has a bunch of articles and information about boarding school. Again, this is a relatively specialty topic, so if your family is interested in understanding boarding school, and again, this would be for typically the high school age students, then listen on. We've got a lot of great information. If you want to get a hold of Justin, he can be reached at www.justinmuchnick.com, and he's also active on Facebook and Twitter. Here's the interview. All right, today we're sitting down with Justin Muchnick. He is the author of the Boarding School Survival Guide. Welcome, Justin.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the show.
My pleasure. So, obviously you wrote a book about boarding school, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to be writing a book at a relatively young age and, why you did it and some of those things.
Yeah, so I think this story sort of starts with why I even wanted to go to boarding school in the first place. I'm from California, and, the most traditional high school path is to, go to your local public or private high school and then go from there. But for me, I was really inspired by this 7th grade literature teacher that I had who was a writer in residence at this boarding school on the East Coast called Phillips Exeter Academy. And he taught in a way that was so discussion-based and, Socratic and talking back and forth rather than, your traditional sit down, raise your hand, wait for the answer to be called on. And I really liked his method of teaching because I'm a guy that loves to debate, to discuss. I like talking like that and having a conversation with my teachers and my peers. And so I figured, well, why don't I seek out, a high school experience where I can get this intellectual stimulation that my 7th grade literature teacher, Mr. Rogers, is giving, and I can get that in every class with people who all want to be there because they think, it's cool to be smart and they want to learn in a discussion-based environment. So I applied to all these boarding schools, but it was really tough for me to get good information on all the schools. I could get what the schools said in their magazines and their view books, their websites, what admissions officers are telling me. But it was hard to get the student perspective because, I didn't know so many people who had gone to boarding school, who had taken that path. So that whole process, I was thinking, well, if only there, was a book, was a good way to get all this real information from students about what boarding school is really like. So, fast forward to the middle and end of my freshman year at school, and I decided that I wanted to make that idea a reality because there's a real void there in the market for a book like that. So I pitched the Boarding School Survival Guide to a few publishers, a lot of publishers, and a few were interested, and eventually I was able to get Peterson's to agree to publish the book. And the book is set up in that there are 25 different chapters from 25 different authors from boarding schools all across the country. You have, traditional New England boarding schools, you have math and science boarding schools, you have boarding schools on the West Coast that are all represented in this book. And I really like that in that you have a lot of different authentic voices instead of, just me talking here. I'm no expert on all aspects of boarding school life. I've only been there now for 2 years, and when I was writing the book, I had only been there for a year, so I don't know all the ins and outs yet. So I figured that if I could get, all these other contributors who go to boarding school to help tell the boarding school story, I could get a really, really authentic feel to the book. So that's sort of how the book came to be.
Okay, so the book covers, a number of different students' perspectives on boarding schools. So why don't you tell me a little bit about, other than the teachers, what else attracted you to, and what are the pluses, in your opinion, of boarding schools?
I think the, most major benefit of a boarding school, in my opinion, is the really outstanding people that you meet there. Because at a boarding school, this is the most diverse community I think I've ever seen. On my hall in my dorm alone, there's a guy from Belgium, a guy from Korea, a guy from 30 minutes away in Massachusetts, me from California, people from all over the world. And when you get people that have so many different perspectives and stories, and in addition, they also are really interested in learning and passionate about, intellectual discourse, you can have really fantastic conversations with them inside and outside of the classroom. So, I think I do half of my learning in my scheduled classes with really fantastic teachers and interesting topics, but I do the other half of my learning when I'm in the dorm on a Friday night, or when I'm eating a meal at the dining hall, or even, on the way to wrestling practice when I'm talking with my friend from the team, and we have, great dialogue and stuff. And, that's a great way to learn and to see different perspectives. So I like that a lot, that it's a community of people that like learning and are interested in learning outside of the classroom.
Okay, so I guess one of the preconceptions that I have of I guess there's two preconceived notions when you talk about boarding schools. One is from the TV, where the really snobby rich people, have these prestigious schools and you have to have a certain social standing, or perhaps you're the token scholarship kid. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, as a California kid who also, had the majority of his boarding school knowledge from TV, books, and popular culture. I mean, personally, I thought boarding school, if you told me, you go to a boarding school when I was in 7th grade and I didn't know about the whole world, I would have thought, a military school or a place where they send troubled children. But, there's also, the stereotype that it's all rich kids or preppy kids or whatever. But, the more that you understand the world of boarding schools, and, the more that you're immersed in it, you realize that it's really not the case, because nowadays I think schools do a great job with financial aid. Andover, the school I go to, has a large endowment and is able to attract kids of all socioeconomic classes and all social standings, driven, and they want to learn, and they're smart, nice kids. So I think, I can only speak for Andover, but also based on, all these other submissions and contributions I've received for my book from all these other boarding schools, it's really not the case where, there's just a particular socioeconomic class that gets to go to boarding school.
Mm-hmm. So obviously your parents stayed at home in California, and you're completely across the country in New England. How often do you get home? What is your typical day like? It seems like a pretty big leap for maybe 14-year-old when you went as a freshman? Yeah,
exactly. So that, leaving home was definitely a worry for me when I was thinking about boarding schools, and is certainly, I think, one of the biggest struggles that I've had, in these past 2 years at boarding school, because I did not by any means go to boarding school to, get away from my family. In fact, I have 3 younger siblings and a really, really tight-knit family. I've been really fortunate to have, supportive parents and siblings throughout my whole life. So it was tough to, take that leap to go to the East Coast, basically almost doing what a lot of people do when they leave for college, but I was doing it, 4 years earlier. I sort of coped with that through Skype calls, text calls. I talk to my parents every single day when I'm at school, and, my siblings I talk to a lot as well. We had, scheduled phone call times. My freshman year, I'd call them every Sunday night. And now that I'm more comfortable in my world at Andover, I shoot them a text when I'm walking in between classes. I talk to them on the phone when, I want to talk to them or whatever. But, I think because my family loves each other so much, we have been able to find a pretty good way of, staying in touch and communicating, even though we're all the way across the country.
All right. So that's obviously one aspect. So what is it that you do all day? Obviously you don't go home and play video games like most kids when school is out, or go home and study. So you go back to a dorm. So how does that work?
Yeah, so for school hours, like 8 to 3, it's sort of like a normal high school in that, I'm going to classes and, I have my period for lunch and stuff like that. But, I guess the difference during the school days, I, can go back to my dorm to switch out textbooks. I can do stuff like that or whatever. But then after school, everyone at Andover is required to do some sort of athletic activity after school. So I go to my sport. In the fall, I play soccer. In the winter, I wrestle. And this spring I did PE, so I'll go to that after school. And then when I get home, or when I get done with my athletic commitment around 5:30, I generally head to the dining hall for dinner. And then after that, depending on the day, there are a lot of different clubs and activities that meet. So I'm part of the chess club, so I do that every Tuesday and Friday night. and that's a really, really fun, hour and a half that I get to spend playing chess. And then, of course, a good amount of homework, like I guess a lot of other high schools. So I spend a lot of time on the weekdays doing that. And then on the weekends, the school has, different events every week. There are dances, there are, sometimes comedians that come to the school, the big popular events like Hypnotist. Whenever he comes, I think, once a year. So lots of people like that. But the school puts on a lot of, events because it's harder to get, to the movies, theater with your friends or whatever like that because you're on campus. And then I think a really social aspect of boarding school that you don't really get at a normal high school is that, you're living with your peers the whole day. So instead of going home to, my house and, spending the evening with my parents and siblings, I'm spending the evening with all my dorm mates who I've become really close to, or at least, a few friends from the dorm that I really like spending time with. So, I'll hang out in their room or we'll talk about something or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So describe the dorm to us a little bit. How many people on a floor or in a cluster, or how is it situated?
At Andover, it's a little bit unique in that there are dorms specifically for freshmen. So freshmen only live with other freshmen. And then there are dorms for non-freshmen. So I think that's a good system because when I was transitioning to Andover freshman year, I was in this large freshman dorm called Rockwell. And so there were 39 other freshman boys in my dorm, and we all had singles, which was nice. But in a freshman dorm, everybody's going through that transition of being new to boarding school together. And then after that, when you're not a freshman anymore, there are a lot more different housing options. So some people elect to do what Andover calls a stack, which is, get 3 or 4 of your really close friends and live in a smaller dorm that's a little bit off campus or a little bit further from campus together. So some people do that. I chose to go into the all-school lottery, and I am now living in a dorm called Bartlett that's right on campus, right, next to the dining hall with 30 other kids that are sophomores, juniors, or seniors. After your freshman year, you have a little bit more freedom to pick whether you want a single or a double. Who do you want as your roommate? Because, your freshman year, you're assigned, whereas senior year, you choose your roommates. So you have more freedom as you grow older to choose where you live on campus.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. All right, so I guess how big is a boarding school? You mentioned a number of different dorms and stuff. So how many students are at your school?
Andover has almost 1,200 students, and about a quarter of those are day students. We're one of the bigger boarding schools. Some boarding schools have as little as 200 students, and a lot of boarding schools, fall in the category of having 600 to 800 students.
Mm-hmm. When you went through the boarding school process, how many schools did you consider in addition to the one you're at?
Since I was fairly new to the very new to the boarding school world, I looked at a lot more schools than I ended up applying to, mainly because I didn't really know anything about any of the schools. So I ended up applying to 4 schools, including Andover, and I sort of made my list of schools I was going to apply to based on a number of factors. I wanted, a larger school rather than, a school with 200 or 300 students, mainly because I'd come from a small school and I didn't want to have like a feeling where I'd feel like I've outgrown it. I, also narrowed my list down based on dress code. I really do not like wearing, ties and blazers and stuff like that. I'd been in a uniform for, 9 years from kindergarten to 8th grade. So I sort of crossed out any school where I'd have to wear, a coat and tie, which was sort of a frivolous parameter. But, I had a couple other parameters, and I eventually applied to 4 and selected Andover.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So who do you think would be a good fit? I mean, obviously there's a boarding school industry out there. Do you have any idea how many boarding schools there actually are, or any statistics like that?
Yeah, there's between, I think, 200 and 300 boarding schools. About 0.5% of high school students attend boarding school.
Okay, great. So you're in a very small group of kids out there.
Yeah, it's sort of a niche market.
Yes. Who do you think is a good fit for a boarding school, or who do you think is not a good fit? Did you get any, in all the interviews and stuff that you did, is there a kind of a common theme that you discovered, or?
Yeah. So if, you want to attend a boarding school, you definitely, number one, need to be interested in academics and working hard at those academics, because most boarding schools have pretty rigorous curriculums and classes. So, generally, if you're not wanting to go to boarding school for, some sort of academic reason or intellectual reason, you probably wouldn't be a good fit. Another, not really requirement, but sign of if boarding school is, a good fit for you is, as I was saying before, like if you sort of are into working hard or having, your own sense of personal responsibility, because, at boarding school, your parents aren't there to, help you every step of the way.
So I guess another question I have, and again, because I don't know a whole lot about boarding school, and I think probably 99% of the world out there doesn't, is if your parents aren't there and who supervises you? Or, I mean, if you said I wanted to go to the movie, obviously you'd ask your parents if you're at home. If you're at a boarding school, how do you get permission to leave the premises, or who's the adult responsible for you? How does that work?
Right, great question. At Andover, there are faculty members who act as house counselors in each dorm. So they're sort of your, surrogate parents or whatever, in that they're setting the rules and enforcing, lights out if they wish to and things like that. So you ask your house counselor, if you could have a day excuse to go into the town and go to the movies, for example, or, to take a train into Boston on a weekend. Those questions would be directed to your house counselor, who also is, there to enforce rules. Another supervisor type person would be your prefect or proctor, which is an older student that lives in your dorm, and they act sort of as your, big brother type of thing, or big sister. So like in freshman dorms, juniors are like picked to be prefects in those dorms and, answer any questions that the freshmen might have about transition or help them with adjusting to the rigors of boarding school, and, giving their own advice and tips and stuff like that. So those are people to look to within your dorm as well.
Mm-hmm. So is your school co-ed?
Yes, it is.
Are most of them co-ed or split, or do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, nowadays, most boarding schools are co-ed. Andover's been co-ed for a little over 40 years. But there are still some single-sex schools out there. Actually, in my book, there's a chapter written by a student from Miss Porter's, which is an all-girls school, about what it's like to live and learn at a single-sex school.
Mm-hmm. So then, are students allowed to date and that kind of stuff? How does that work?
Yeah, there are certain restrictions on room visiting hours and lights out, or like in your dorm hours. Like you can't be out past 11:30 on Saturdays, and things like that. So a little bit different, I guess, than conventional high school. But yeah, there's definitely people who date in boarding school, people who don't date in boarding school. I think pretty similarly to what you would find at, another high school.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess some of the thought process, I'm assuming that Andover, and if you read most of the literature for boarding schools, they talk about their ability to prepare you for college. Is that a typical selling point for a boarding school?
Yeah, I think so. In that boarding school, in my opinion, is the closest you can get to college without going to college, if that makes any sense. But it is sort of like a college environment, like a small liberal arts campus, certainly for Andover, a very, college preparatory curriculum. Also, in the sense that, you're living on your own like you would do in college. So you're, making that adjustment, the similar adjustment you'd be making when you're going to college.
Right. But even boarding schools obviously have an extra layer, but even a typical private high school, a lot of them, what they claim is we're college prep, and therefore, our average SAT score or our average ACT score is this wonderful, and we send kids to these prestigious schools. And that's why you should pay the tuition and send your student to our school, is because we're going to prepare them for getting into Harvard or getting into a prestigious school or whatever it might be. Is that part of the decision process that you went through? Is it part of the decision process that you think that others go through?
Well, some boarding schools do have, like historically a big name or whatever. But for me, my decision to attend boarding school was purely about, I just wanted to get the best academic experience that I thought I could get in my high school years. And it, there was no factor into, will this make my chances of getting into X college more or less likely? Nothing like that. And I think if you want to go to boarding school to get into a particular college, you're probably going for the wrong reasons, in that you're not really going to enjoy the boarding school experience if you're worried about 4 years, 3 years, 2 years down the line where you're going to go to school for college. Because, for me, I'm just trying to, enjoy the academic and stimulating opportunities that are, thrown at me these 4 years, and then I'll let the next 4 years sort of work themselves out.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about the book. You mentioned that there's 25 chapters from 25 different authors. Can you give us a flavor of what types of groups they are? I mean, obviously, I would assume male and female and seniors and freshmen and that kind of stuff. But is there any other, interesting tidbits as far as how you chose who the authors would be?
Yeah, so I made a list before I had all my authors, or I was searching for contributors. I made a list of, some chapters that I'd like to include in a book about boarding school, including what to pack for boarding school, or, how to get acclimated at orientation at boarding school, or managing your time at boarding school. So I had those chapters sort of slated out, and I was looking for contributors to write chapters about those topics. But then in addition, some people wrote to me saying, I really want to write for your book, but I have a great idea for a chapter. Do you think I could write about that? So, for example, this guy from Lawrenceville said, what I really wish is if there was a chapter about entering boarding school late, so as a 10th grader or 11th grader. And I said, you know what? That never even crossed my mind, because I wouldn't think about, entering boarding school late because I entered as a 9th grader. But you have experience doing that. He entered Lawrenceville, another boarding school, as a 10th grader. And if you want to write about that and tell people how to cope with that, then go ahead. So I sort of like that the chapters in that way are a little bit influenced by what other boarding school students want to hear about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then what are some of the other topics that are covered in the various chapters?
Yeah, my chapter is a chapter about why would you want to attend boarding school in general. There are other chapters. There's one about like revisit days once you're admitted to a school, how to make the most of, a visit back to that school, like on, an admitted student's day. There are chapters about, managing your money at boarding school. There's a chapter about nutrition at boarding school and how to eat in a dining hall, for the first time. There's a very important chapter about living in a dorm and, doing your own laundry and living with roommates and things like that. So, yeah, there are chapters about, a lot of different aspects of boarding school life.
So this not only covers someone that's searching for a boarding school or trying to figure out if they want to attend one, but also kind of the how-to once you're there.
Yeah, exactly. In that sense, I feel like this book sort of caters for different reasons to any person that is interested in the boarding school world at all, because people who are thinking about whether they should apply would really benefit from reading this book, because they'd see, what is life like once I am admitted to boarding school, or what's the application process like? People that are applying to boarding school similarly can see, well, how do I apply to boarding school? What are the steps to take? What do I do when I'm visiting a campus? And then people that are at boarding school can say, okay, well, now I'm at school, how do I set up my dorm room? How do I, eat at the dining hall? Or, how do I make healthy choices there? And then I also think that parents of students would really benefit from reading this book, because they can see through, a student's eyes what the experience that their son or daughter is going to be going through is like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if a parent or a student wanted to get your book, can you tell us what the title is and where it's available again?
Yeah, so it's called The Boarding School Survival Guide, and it's available in bookstores everywhere, as well as online at Peterson's Publishing. Okay,
great. Well, I appreciate you spending a little bit of time teaching us about boarding schools, and I hope that things go well for you in your college process. We'll touch back again maybe in a year or two to see where you're at as far as the college process.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Justin.
All right. Have a nice day.
All right. All right. That wraps up our interview with Justin. As always, if you enjoy what you hear, we would appreciate it if you would give us ratings and reviews in iTunes. Also, if you need more information or you want to get some of the details of this show, it's available at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com/18B as in boy. Show episode 18B for bonus. So again, you can get all the show notes at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com/18B as in boy. I appreciate you listening. We will be back with a regular episode on Thursday. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns two companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.